All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We got a little bit over 80 folks joining us now, but over 200 in attendance that have registered. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Cami Sacco, and I am the Sustainability Coordinator for the Office of Leadership and Community Engagement. Just a couple of notes before we do introductions and start the panel or the conversation tonight. Everybody was put on mute, but if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. I'll be watching them throughout the conversation, and we've allotted about 20 minutes for Q&A because we know that those are sometimes just as important as the actual conversation. So the event tonight is scheduled from 7 to 8, and we are going to be conscious of everybody's time. So we will end at 8 o'clock. And so just tonight, just to give you a little introduction, we're hosting a conversation between Dr. Addie Martindale and Elizabeth Cline. Intro's coming in just a moment. One thing that I just wanted to note from a larger sustainability perspective is that a lot of us think of sustainability as just automatically thinking of environmental sustainability. So we think about recycling or waste or energy or water, but what we don't think about is the social sustainability side. And so Elizabeth tonight is going to talk about both the social and environmental cost of the fashion industry. And so a reminder that the three pillars of sustainability are social, environmental, and economic. So, we're so happy to have Elizabeth join us. So I'll give you a short introduction of Dr. Addie Martindale first. And so Dr. Addie Martindale is an experienced assistant professor in the School of Human Ecology at Georgia Southern University with retailing and product development industry experience. Her research focuses on the experiences of non-traditional apparel consumers, functional apparel design for wearer empowerment, and apparel sustainability. Elizabeth Cline is a New York-based author, journalist, and expert on consumer culture, fast fashion, sustainability, and labor rights in the apparel industry. Her first book, the critically acclaimed Overdressed: The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion, explored the toll of fast fashion and the global apparel industry on environmental and human rights, and helped spawn a global, ethical, and sustainable fashion movement to reform the industry. Her 2019 follow-up, The Conscious Closet, shows how everyday consumers can transform fashion into a force for good. Cline's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, among other publications, and she is a frequent commentator on NBC Nightly News, China Global News Network, NPR, and many other media outlets. All right, y'all, take it away. And please, a reminder to put questions in the chat box.
Elizabeth, thank you again for joining us tonight. I wonder if you would start off with telling us about what led you to start writing about the fashion industry.
Sure. First of all, I'm so excited to be here. I, of course, wish that I was in person with you in person. I'm originally from South Georgia, which I already shared with the group that I spoke to earlier. But yeah, I'm originally from Cairo, Georgia. So for me, I started writing about the fashion industry when I was in college. Normally, I start my story a little bit later, but when I was in college, I worked on a campaign on my campus. I went to Syracuse University, and a group of students, we all got together and decided we wanted our campus to only sell sweatshop-free living wage apparel. So we organized and put together this campaign that lasted for almost 2 years, and we finally got our campus to sign on to the WRC, which is the Worker Rights Consortium. And that was my introduction. That was how I started to think about how clothing is connected to the world around us. But I actually, one of the first slides I wanted to show was the more personal reason why I got interested in the fashion industry is because I was a cheap fashion addict. This is a picture from my first book, Overdressed. This is the 354 items of clothing that I accumulated as a shopaholic, I guess you could say. And I really was curious at that point in my life. I was working in journalism in New York, and I considered myself to be a conscious consumer of food. But when it came to my closet, there was no reflection. I had no idea where any of this stuff came from, what it was made out of, what it was doing to the world. And when Overdress came out, that conversation hadn't really started yet. It was 2012. People weren't really making the connections between what we're wearing and all these other bigger global issues that we are going to talk about tonight.
50 million, are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay, it was just something came up on the screen. Sorry about that. It is important to acknowledge that 50 million garment and textile workers are in the world. These individuals are part of a hidden supply chain that most of us rarely see unless something bad happens and is covered in the news. Since the pandemic started, you've been working on a labor rights campaign called Pay Up. Would you tell us a little more about it and what it's accomplished?
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have some media to share from the campaign. So I'm glad that you brought up, first of all, the fact that we kind of only hear about what's going on in the supply chain when something bad happens. There are an estimated 50 million garment and textile workers around the world. And the reason why there's so many people that work in this industry is because fashion is still incredibly labor intensive. For the most part, like every seam on the clothes that we're wearing were put there by a person behind a sewing machine. And that's good in a lot of ways because it creates jobs for people around the world. Fashion is one of the world's largest employers. It employs people from cotton farmers to people who work in textile mills to people who work in fashion merchandising. It's just this huge job driver. But of course, as most of us are aware, it also has a reputation for creating really terrible jobs at the very bottom of the supply chain. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was paying close attention to what was going on in Bangladesh, which is the world's second largest exporter of clothing behind China. And I had planned to be in Bangladesh to do some reporting in April. And so I just happened to be paying a close attention to the fashion press in March when the pandemic started. And I noticed that once all of the clothing stores had to close, they were forced to shutter during the pandemic, that brands and retailers started canceling their orders. Now, the fashion industry works a little bit differently than some others in that they require their factories to work several months in advance. The factories pay all of the upfront costs for labor and materials, and then the brands pay them back. So when brands and retailers said, we're not paying or we're canceling, what they meant was they were refusing to pay for work that was already done. And this was the beginning of the Pay Up campaign. And the Pay Up campaign started as a handful of people working to get brands to pay their bills, pay for the orders they placed prior to the pandemic. And it grew into a global movement, mostly just through using this hashtag and tagging brands on social media. And today, hundreds of thousands of people have participated in it around the world. And we've managed to recoup $15 billion that was owed to factories so that garment workers can get paid. So I think we have a couple of slides here. So this is, I believe this is a worker in Bangladesh. This was something that was posted on social media. So we've had people all around the world to use the hashtag PayUp. And if you want to be part of the campaign, you can also post pictures of yourself asking brands to pay up as well. So this is a factory owner in Bangladesh on the right. His name is Mostafiz Udin, and this is a garment worker. Her name is escaping me right now, but this is This is the day that most Safis found out that the brands that he manufactures clothing for were not going to pay him for all of this stuff. You can see the boxes of it piled up that they had already made. And 8 months later, he has been paid by some of the brands, but then there are brands like a British fast fashion company called Peacocks that still has not paid him. I believe he's also owed money by P. Diddy's fashion brand, Sean John. He's still owed millions of dollars for all of the stuff that he's already made. And he's at the same time trying to keep everybody, all of his workers working and paid. And it's just creating this really stressful economic crisis in the middle of a pandemic. I believe the next slide might be our video. Okay, so this is Primark has paid up now, yay. It took a lot of pressure for Primark to pay, and it was because they were paying some orders, and then other orders they were only, they were asking for discounts. And then after that, some of their factories started busting the unions in their factories. But we've kind of pushed Primark to come around over the last few months, and now they are on the positive side of what we call the tracker. So they're one of the brands that have paid up. Okay, next slide. So this is our video about what's going on in the supply chain right now. If it'll let us play it. Okay, it's playing, but I still can't hear anything. Okay, yeah, now I can hear. Great, thank you.
Most of the multinational fashion retailer, they cancel the order from Bangladesh. They want discount, they want suspension, they want to pay pending.
আমাদের এপ্রিল মাসের বেতন 60% দিবে। তো আমাদের 60% বেতন দিলে যা পাবো তার দিয়ে ঘর ভাড়া দিলে আর 1 থেকে 1,500 টাকা থাকবে। এই টাকা দিয়ে আমি নিজে চলবো না আমার বাড়িতে ছোট ভাই একটা বোবা, ছোট বোন একটা অসুস্থ, তাদেরকে দেখবো।
যে আমাদের এইভাবে যদি শীতের বেতন দেওয়া হয় তাহলে তো আমার ফ্যামিলি চলবে না। তাই ভাইয়ের যে কাজটা ক্যান্সেল করছে এই কাজটা আবার পুনরায় অর্ডার দেওয়ার জন্য ভাইয়ের কাছে আমাদের রিকোয়েস্ট থাকবে।
তো আমরা আবার কাজ করতে চাই, তো আমরা করোনায় মরবো না, আমরা না খেয়ে মরবো। আমাদের ঝুঁকি ভাতা দেওয়া উচিত।
No money means no food. So pay up now.
So I do want to say that the list of brands that were shown there, a number of those brands have agreed to pay up in recent months. And if you want an updated list of brands that we're targeting, you can follow me on social media at Elizabeth L. Cline, or you can follow Remake's account, which is remake.world. But yeah, one of the things that we're working on next with the campaign, you might have noticed it showed the wages for workers, right? So you've got in Bangladesh workers who are making maybe $100 a month working for brands that generate billions of dollars in profit every year. So one of the goals of the campaign coming out of the pandemic is to figure out new types of regulations and purchase orders and contracts between brands and suppliers so that we can elevate workers' wages so they don't end up in this crisis again. Because one of the reasons why canceling orders is so devastating to begin with is if people are out of a job, they have no savings, they have no safety net. They immediately go from being laid off to needing food. So the campaign has turned into a call for long-term systemic reforms in the fashion industry moving forward.
The sweatshop stories that we see in the media depict horrible working conditions as a norm in the apparel industry. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit about why these horrible why these bad jobs persist in the garment industry, and maybe share with us a few good examples of brands that don't exploit their workers?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, because a lot of times the way the conversation about exploitation in fashion happens is that we should feel motivated to change things because we feel sorry for poor people, but really there's a structural problem in the fashion industry that prevents garment workers from earning a living wage. So what's happened is the sweatshop system persists because it's a contracted system. So brands don't legally own these factories, even though they in many ways control what happens inside of the factories. So the prices that they pay to factories, for example, dictates how much money a supplier has available to pay his workers or her workers. It determines the payroll for that factory. What's more, when brands tell a factory, I want 40,000 units and I want it in a week, that determines the pace of work in factories, that determines how many hours garment workers put in. So the reason why we have sweatshops, I really, really believe this, is because we have not updated our labor laws and our regulations so that brands are held accountable for what happens in their supply chain. And it's been this way for about 25 years. There was a period of time when the industry was more regulated, it was more unionized. You could point to examples where there were good working conditions. And I think that's really important to remember, because then we can start to talk about solutions and how do we get out of this and how do we create a really equitable industry. So Adi, to your point, you asked, is there an example of a good garment factory? And of course there are good garment factories. And one of them is called Alta Gracia, and it actually makes a lot of the collegiate apparel that's sold in the United States. Now this is just a picture of the factory that I pulled off the internet, but I have been to Alta Gracia. It is in the Dominican Republic. And so what makes this factory unique is something that shouldn't make it unique at all. It is one of the world's only unionized living wage garment factories. And the way they've been able to achieve this is that the company they make the clothes for, this is me when I was working on Overdressed, learning how to make a t-shirt at Alta Gracia. So Alta Gracia is, it's owned by the facility that or company that it makes clothes for. So it's like vertically integrated, but they make t-shirts and collegiate apparel for many, many universities in the United States. The reason why I wanted to include this photo, I believe this woman's name was Patricia, but I think I was in Alta Gracia in 2011, so it's been a while. So the reason why she's so happy in this picture is because so at Alta Gracia, workers make enough money to where they can save up and invest in their education, in their children's education. A lot of people just ended up, you know, adding extensions onto their houses. So this woman was very happy because she had her extended family living with her. It was like her parents, like a grandparent, many kids, all living in one really small house. So she was able to finally build a house for herself behind the main house. So her and her kids had their own space, and it was completely transformative for her. Believe it or not, this is not the case in other garment producing areas, because people, they make a poverty wage. So basically they make just enough to put food on the table, to you know, pay their rent, and that's about it. Maybe their kids' school fees, but there's not enough money for them to invest in a better life. Which is totally inexcusable in our world today, where there is so much wealth and the fashion industry is just, you know, so profitable. And I really believe that that wealth should be spread out equally. And you can see, I guess that's a, yeah, Georgia Bulldogs sweatshirt down there that was made in Altagracia.
Elizabeth, the term sustainable fashion is starting to get a lot of buzz, and we're hearing it more, and consumers are starting to pay attention to it. Can you talk a little bit about how the clothes we buy are connected to the planet?
Yeah, absolutely. We're covering so much territory here, guys, so feel free to pop questions in the Q&A for later. So the fashion industry has a really big impact on the planet, a really surprisingly huge impact on the planet. Depending on what studies you look at, it's, you know, responsible for anywhere from 4 to 8% of climate change impact. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. It's also one of the largest industrial users of water. It's a huge consumer of fossil fuels. And I kind of want to get into why that is. And the first part of it, and I have 2 slides that kind of explain this, is it's just a matter of scale. You know, we're approaching 8 billion people on this planet. Most of us buy clothes. We don't make our clothes anymore. And consumers around the world are, for the most part, becoming more middle class. They're becoming more consumer oriented, like we are here in the United States. So that means we are making more stuff. And in fact, it's estimated that globally, clothing consumption has doubled just in the last 15 years. And the impact of the industry is expected to double again within the next 10. So it's just growing really, really, really fast. This first picture is of a plastic refinery. The volume of cotton being worn in the world is about the same today as it was 20 years ago. So when I say that we've doubled our consumption of clothing, almost all of that increase has come from synthetics. Synthetics are plastics, and plastics come from fossil fuels. So there you can start to understand why the industry is also connected to climate change. And then in the second picture, cotton is the second, after polyester. Cotton is the most popular material worn in the world. And I mean, this I think is a field in Texas, if I remember correctly. This is from the Department of Agriculture. But there's just so much natural fiber being manufactured now too, and a lot of it is grown industrially. You know, a farm today looks more like a factory than it does a farm, especially in the United States. So you've got, and I mean, you guys are in Georgia, so you've all seen a cotton field, but in Texas, they're huge. These are industrial systems that churn out lots and lots and lots of fiber. And it has a huge impact on the planet. You know, cotton requires water. Most of these fields are irrigated. Most of these farmers are using pesticides. That's why there aren't any people in that field, because the farmers have replaced manual labor with chemicals. So one, fashion has a big impact because of its scale. The second reason why the industry has such a big environmental impact is because in the race to the bottom to produce clothing cheaply, the industry is cutting corners. You're looking at, this is a picture taken by Greenpeace of water pollution created by dyes from a textile mill. So instead of, you know, we obviously have the technology for this to not happen, but it's not happening in situations where brands either aren't paying to invest in sustainability, or where local governments are not enforcing environmental regulations. So we get to still wear clothes that are polluting someone else's environment And we get to enjoy low prices because costs were cut in other areas. And I think that the video pertains to the next question, maybe. Yeah, the waste, that the video is for the waste question. I might have put it in the wrong spot.
So Elizabeth, every second the fashion industry produces as much as one garbage truck full of textile waste. Can you tell us a little bit about what happens to the clothing and where it ends up?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things to research. When I was writing Overdressed, the book is called the shockingly high cost of cheap fashion. And one of the most shocking moments for me reporting the book was I went to a local Salvation Army, and the manager gave me a tour, and he showed me how the facility worked. And he took me to this warehouse, and it was full floor to ceiling everywhere as far as the eye could see, with clothes packed into these bales. And I think they weighed like maybe a half a ton each. And it was just all of the clothing that Goodwill couldn't sell in a given day, because they were receiving so many donations. They were just so overloaded with clothing. And I was like, do you ever run out of clothes? And he laughed at me. Like, he was just like, no, that it was the thought that there would ever be a situation, right? So that's when I started exploring the secondhand clothing supply chain. And I've been to Kenya, which is East Africa, is where a lot of the secondhand clothes from the United States end up. And this is a facility in New Jersey. So this is kind of like the stopping point before Kenya. So this is where everything that the charity can't sell ends up in this facility, and then they sort it again and they decide where it's going to go. So maybe some stuff will go to Eastern Europe for the vintage markets. If it's leather, maybe it'll go to like a colder climate. And if it's t-shirt and warm weather clothes, it'll go to Africa. And so there's just all of this stuff flowing through this system. And this is in Kenya, and that's a secondhand clothing dealer named Shadra. And I included this picture because you can see the charity price tags are still on there. So that for me just kind of connected how our donations go from our local thrift shop and end up on the other side of the world. So on the one hand, it's great that things are being reused, right? But we can also imagine all the reasons why this might not be the best system. And one of the most surprising things that sort of come to light in recent years is that increasingly our used clothes are being shipped around the world, and then they end up in the trash in East Africa. So this is a video from the Orr Foundation, which works in Ghana, and they're showing trash collectors at the secondhand market. They're putting all of these clothes from the US and Europe into this dump truck, and then they're going to take it to a landfill and throw it out. And so these dump trucks are filled up multiple times a day, and they take all of that outside of the city and put it in the dump. So it goes, and this is stuff that doesn't even get a chance to sell in the local markets. The secondhand, the same way we do when you look at something at a thrift store and you're like, if it's not something that's worth selling, they just throw it in the trash. So our increasing consumption has created this massive textile waste problem that is overwhelming recyclers, the secondhand industry. It's just become this really massive issue that's kind of like the mirror image of our fast fashion industry in the West.
Thank you. So ethical and sustainable fashion you know, it really seems to be expensive and unattainable to most of us, especially college students and those of us who are living in rural areas. What are some ways that we can reduce our negative impact on the environment and the people working to produce our clothing, yet still be fashion consumers?
So that's such a good question. And, you know, I think that we're at a crossroads. You know, one of the reasons why I love talking to college students is because we need more solutions for this problem. You know, just in the last half hour, I've told everyone listening that we have to figure out how to grow cotton without gobs of chemicals. You know, we have to figure out how to come up with new textile recycling technologies. We have to figure out, you know, I know in fashion merchandising, a lot of the conversation is about design. How do you design clothes with less waste? How do you pick materials that have less of an impact on the environment? So there are just like so many different ways to come at it, right? With the Conscious Closet, I was trying to empower, the goal is to empower people to understand that your individual actions and your everyday clothing consumption choices can make a difference too. So one of the things we've been talking about tonight is the kind of huge global environmental impact of fashion and how that's connected to human rights, and then how that's also tied back to the economy, as Cami was saying in her introduction. But we also know, and I think common sense would tell us, that to be sustainable does not mean you have to go out and fill your closet with a $100 organic cotton dress. It means that you can, and you know, I put up some ideas here, but one, wear what you've already got. One of the problems with the fashion industry right now is massive amounts of overconsumption. And I'm sure no one listening will be surprised to know that it's Americans who are, you know, we are the biggest consumers. I think China is catching up and Europe is close behind us, but we just buy a lot of stuff. And I think that one thing that's happening right now, and you know, I hear it so often from people in college, is people are really rediscovering how to sew and how to DIY, and really reconnecting with what they wear and getting off the fast fashion treadmill and just reconnecting with a more like active relationship with their clothes. But yeah, so I can walk through some of my favorite easy and cheap ways to be sustainable. We already mentioned shop your closet, and that also includes DIYing and upcycling your closet. College students, I still buy most of my clothes secondhand, but definitely when I was in college, pretty much everything I bought was from the thrift store. And one thing that's really awesome about thrifting now is you can do it online, but then I also know in Statesboro, you have plenty of local retail thrift shops. So I put some of those in there. So Retail's Thrift Shop, Reflective Collective, the CSM, and Charlie's Funky Junk. So the third tip to donate responsibly, we don't often think about that, but that one is actually super important. So if you think about last time you went to donate your clothes, you might have had the pile where you were like, the thrift store isn't going to take this. It's too worn out, so I'm just going to throw it away. And then there might have been something that you donated that you should have repaired or restored in some way before you donated. Thrift stores, normally if something is like missing a button or it has a stain, that can be the thing that makes them not put it out on the floor. So it's actually really important to make that extra effort to just take care of your clothes and to make sure they're ready to have a second life. And as for recycling, I can't answer this question for you. You'll have to ask the thrift stores in your community, but some thrift stores actually partner with textile recyclers. So it could be that that pair of socks that you normally throw in the trash could be something that one of your local thrift stores would take. But the only way to find out is just to call and ask them if you can donate worn out items along with good items. And the fourth tip on this slide is shopping green and ethical brands. So it's actually at the very, very, very bottom of the list of things that I recommend people do. There are all these other ways you can make a difference before we even get to like shopping, right? Or shopping for new clothes. And, you know, if any of you have questions about how to tell if a brand is ethical or green, we can talk about that. But there are two really, really great online resources I'll recommend that are much more thorough than I can really get into here. And one is called Good on You, and it pretty much ranks big brands, small brands, everything in between. It makes it really, really, really easy to shop consciously. And then Remake, which is a nonprofit, and we shared their video earlier. They work on the Pay Up campaign with me. They also have a directory of brands that you can support. That was a lot of information, and I know we have another slide to get to as well. Okay, so this is really, really important. I think a lot of times in our society, we're encouraged to make change through the way that we shop. And my work certainly fits into that paradigm. And I think that the way that we shop, it does make a difference. But I also want to really encourage all of you, and even if ethical and sustainable fashion is not your cause, whatever issues you're interested in, start thinking about how you can build collective power to make change. It really, really makes a difference when you find other people who are doing what you're doing so you can amplify your cause. So when it comes to conscious fashion, there are so many ways you can get involved with this movement and learn more, you know, outside of reading my books and listening to me and having this conversation. The first is like, I would really encourage you to just join an ethical and sustainable fashion group. And I have listed a plethora of them. If you want to be part of Pay Up, and I really hope that you are interested in it, you can find us at payupfashion.com or on Remake's Instagram. The second tip is I would love to see GSU have, I know that there's some conscious fashion projects happening on campus, but seeing a campus group that's dedicated to this issue would be really fantastic. And I've seen that manifest itself in a bunch of different ways on different college campuses. Like some students have established chapters of United Students Against Sweatshops, which was the group that I was in back in college. I've seen others work to bring Alta Gracia sweatshop-free clothes to campus, which could be something else that students work on. I also believe you have some campus groups pre-pandemic who were planning a clothing swap. So, and some people are working on that now. And hopefully once things get a little bit more back to normal, you can start doing things like that again. The third tip, and I know that Addie, you might actually have more input on this than I would, but look around on campus and see if there are classes that intersect with this topic that you can take. And or if you feel like you want to change your major, that's also something else that you can, or just figure out how you can tie this topic back into what you're studying.
Elizabeth, I'm definitely open to talking to any student who would be interested in working on these initiatives.
That's awesome. And then the last thing on this slide is use your voice. I am always completely blown away by how much power a very small number of fashion brands have in controlling these issues. Like, I know we've probably all heard that statistic that something like, what is it, like 80 companies have caused like most of climate change. So that's kind of the situation in fashion, right? You've got 20 brands that control 97% of the profit. They're also creating most of the pollution, right? They're also the ones that are hiring most of the sweatshop workers. So it's really important for us to come together and use your voice. Social media makes it so much easier now to tag brands and say, hey, what are you doing to be sustainable? Are you paying your workers a living wage? So yeah, I just encourage you to get involved that way as well, to kind of just nudge the industry in the right direction. Okay.
I wish we could give her a round of applause, but thank you, Elizabeth, for your chat. There was, I think when we were talking earlier, your stat on how many companies own 20 brands, control 97% of the industry, and its footprint was just massive to me. So so one thing that I forgot to mention in the beginning, attendance verification will have a phrase that will come after the Q&A. So just an FYI for those students who are on the lookout for that. So we have 2 questions right now that have came in, but if others could also start putting those in there, and I wrote one down just in case we don't have enough. So
don't be shy.
Yes.
Ask whatever you want.
I feel like that's always what we say. We're like, come on, please talk. Okay, so our first one is from Ginny, and she said, firstly, thank you so much for talking with us. I want to start my own clothing brand post-graduation, and I want to be as sustainable as I can from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. I know how difficult starting a company will be, and a commitment to sustainability will be an added challenge. Do you have any advice for a young designer?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's really exciting to hear. What I see is all of these smaller sustainable brands coming up and showing the rest of the industry what's possible. I was just interviewing this footwear brand called Thousand Fell that they claim to be the first circular footwear company. But basically every part of their shoe is either renewable or recyclable, and it can be easily disassembled, and then the components can be recycled back into a new shoe. And just a few years ago, I would have thought that would have been impossible, right? And I think that it really shows the power of innovation coming from the startup space. So I think it's really fantastic that, the person asking this question wants to break into doing their own line. Now, as you guys probably know, I'm a journalist, so I'm not necessarily the best person to give advice on how to run a business, but what I would say is find another sustainable brand, another small brand, and find a mentor in the space. My other piece of advice is that it might not be a bad idea to go work in the mainstream industry first, and kind of get your feet wet and then switch from there. But yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways small brands are being sustainable right now.
Okay, Elizabeth, our next question comes from Abigail. And the question is, do you agree with the phrase, no ethical consumption under capitalism?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess since we're all friends here, no, I mean, I was, especially in college, I was very critical of the whole capitalist system. But, it's the system that we live in, and I don't know of anyone who's presented a great alternative to it. So for me, the question is, how can we create a more ethical fashion system within the system that we have? And I actually don't think that we do enough to regulate the industry. Like, I feel like people are constantly kind of talking about like, oh, we just need to kind of start over from scratch. But in the fashion industry, a lot of the problems are really ones of caused by deregulation. We don't have proper labor rights laws. We don't have proper environmental regulations. So I think that what's lacking is political power and rules and regulations on the government level. We keep trying to solve these things through consumerism. And I think that that's what this question is really about. Like, how much can ethical consumers really change? And I would argue that we can change things to a certain extent, but ultimately we need political power, and we need to make change through public rather than private means.
All right, our next question is from Gloria, and she asks, what are your favorite podcasts and or YouTube channels about fashion and sustainability?
So the one that I was listening to the most recently is it's called Conscious Chatter, and that's about all things sustainable fashion. And then they just did a special series called The Root. Now there's this whole other podcast called The Root, but The Root that I'm talking about is like basically like a sub podcast of Conscious Chatter. And it's about how sustainable fashion and racial justice, how those causes have come together in recent months to call for, like bigger changes. And it's really, really cool. I also love Wardrobe Crisis by Claire Press. She wrote this fantastic book also called Wardrobe Crisis. I believe she's Australian, but she's just really fun. She's a great interviewer, and she talks to, I don't know, just like important people in sustainable fashion about everything you can think of, from microplastic pollution to how the industry is going to meet its climate change targets. So yeah, those two are the ones that I would recommend.
Okay, our next question comes from Gabriella, and she wants to know, why do so many brands and companies fail to pay garment workers in factories? Is it some sort of inconvenience?
So brands don't legally own their factories. So if you asked a brand that, they would just say, those aren't my workers. It's not my problem. So what we're trying to prove through our campaign is that one, brands do have a responsibility to people in their factories. And then two, we're trying to change labor laws and regulations so that brands are responsible for what happens in their factories. Because right now it's one of those situations where everybody says, this is not my responsibility, and then workers fall through the cracks. And it's just a system that's set up to be unfair, and it's just persisted for too long. So we really have to just start talking about totally reforming it.
Okay, the next question is from Zylasia. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. She had asked, she kind of goes into it a little bit. So she says, although I have not started my research paper on it, I was thinking of creating an on-campus thrift store of sorts. Georgia Southern is a huge campus, and I feel like we have enough students to start gaining donations and make it happen. I know other campuses have done it before, so it is possible, but I'm not sure how to gain support for it. Is there any advice you have on potentially getting it established?
I think that might be for you, Cammie.
Yeah, that probably is.
I think it's a great idea.
It is. So I absolutely would love to have something like this on campus. I think the basis of what needs to be put in place is a foundation of it to be continued. So if a student starts it, for instance, we don't have the people to manage it because it's a store on campus. And so who is going to be the people that are staffing it and going through the clothes and seeing what goes there and what doesn't go there. So there's so many logistics to it, is that I think it's possible, absolutely, but we need a student like you that's really motivated. You know, that's really what it takes, is for a student to be motivated. And there's another big issue that I know that I've seen on other campuses is just a physical space. So where would we put it? That doesn't mean we can't answer those questions, but those are some of the things, some barriers that I've seen. But I think if there's enough will behind it, it could definitely happen.
One resource I can potentially offer is I know the students that run Owl Swap, it's so hard to say, at Kennesaw State. And they do these huge swaps every semester, and they store the clothes. They've like figured out this whole system. So maybe if that student is motivated to do this project, they could talk to the students at Kennesaw and see how they figured it out, where they stored the clothes, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that any student that wants to get anything started on any campus is look at another campus that's similar to you and what they've done. And we do, in Kennesaw State does have something that is fairly established. And so you know that it works. You know, it's not a year old. It's not just this new initiative where it's kind of rocky. When you know that it has a good foundation, those are the kind of programs that you really want to look to. So,
and one other thing that's really inspiring about what they've done is the student that started the clothing swaps graduated, and then they hired her to run the sustainability initiative on campus. So she was like so inspired to take this on that it became like a full-time gig.
Yeah, so Xylasia, you're more than welcome to email me or just email cfs@georgiasouthern.edu, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you. So yeah, so we'll let Addie take the next question then.
Okay, our next question comes from Savannah. With all the research you've done, do you think we have enough time to slow down or reverse climate change by holding big companies accountable and participating in sustainable fashion?
I think the big thing, the big question right now is, and this is true across every industry, is how to de-link growth in the fashion industry from profits. So right now, pretty much every big brand, the way that they make their money is by opening more stores, selling more product. And even if companies are making very well-intentioned efforts to reduce the impact of those products, if the industry keeps growing at the rate that it's growing, it's just going to keep outstripping any of the gains. So one of the conversations that's happening in fashion right now is switching more of the business model into people making money off of, say, secondhand, resale, rental models, product, extending the life of a product, but still building a business around it. I also can see more people, instead of just going into starting a new brand, maybe starting a recycling business or a technology business. The industry has to figure out how to make money without it just being this cycle of more and more and more stuff. There are a lot of ideas, great ideas happening right now, inspiring ideas. Like, I feel really hopeful, but I get concerned that the industry isn't really facing the fact that it's not going to be able to just keep churning out more stuff every year. And I mean, that's the challenge for our whole economy. It's not just fashion.
Yeah, just overall moving to a more circular system. And so we really just have to change how all of our systems work, including the fashion industry, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question comes from Hope, and she says, how are these companies that do not pay exposed? Is it just by the factory owners that are being impacted, or are there watchdog agencies that try to do this work of keeping companies accountable? And then next, or two-part question, what are your favorite sustainable brands when you do purchase new items?
So that's such a great question about pay up. So how do we know? How do we know who canceled? So the campaign was based on originally a survey of factory owners in Bangladesh, and it was done the first or second week of March. So it was like right when the cancellations happened. And the cancellations were so devastating on the factory owners that they started giving labor rights activists and journalists, myself included, purchase orders, emails showing us contracts. So we had this unprecedented glimpse into how the industry was working and what had really happened. The challenge was getting a list of brands that canceled without brands knowing what factories told us, because factories, most of them live in fear of big brands. They need them to stay in business, right? So, so the campaign is built off of surveys and the work of frontline labor rights groups. So people who are actually in Pakistan, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Los Angeles telling us what's going on. So our campaign is always using current information. And then as for my favorite sustainable fashion brands, I usually don't like picking favorites, but I mean, I will say again that Good On You, that website is great for finding sustainable fashion brands. But I guess I'm trying to support more small sustainable fashion brands. Like I bought all of my masks during the pandemic from Custom Collaborative, which is they're made in New York. And then I also love this upcycled handbag line called Fatra. Yeah, those are two. But I would just look at the directories on Good On You.
Okay, so this is gonna be our last question, and it comes from Monica. Her question relates to career searching. She says, I see so many large clothing brands companies recruiting college students to work. Would it be a negative impact on the environment as well indirectly, since big companies are the ones that are polluting and creating so much waste?
I think that if you have the chance to work at a big brand, you should do it. One, because that you have no idea, like the young people I talk to who end up working in big brands, you can have an extraordinary amount of impact. Like most big brands know that there's a problem and they're really trying to incorporate sustainability into the way that they operate. So you could really be in the middle of the action. And I think that whether you work there or not, these problems are going to persist. So you not working there is not going to make the problem any better. And if it's something that you really feel motivated to fix, I would say take the job and, you know, try to make change from the inside if you can.
All right, you want to take one more at 7:58? Okay, I'm going to take that as okay, one resource I've heard about for starting, this is from April, one resource I've heard about for starting a sustainable fashion business is Factory 45. They're an online fashion accelerator program for sustainable and ethical brands.
That's a great piece of advice. Not a question, just a fantastic comment for the person who asked earlier.
Yes, okay. All right, so I think those are all of our questions and at just about perfect time. So, so for those who need attendance verification, the phrase is Alta Gracia. And so if you'll share that with your professors that need it. And I just want to thank Elizabeth again so much for her time and just her wisdom for kind of the space that she's been in. Just one of the worlds of sustainability, but a very important world nonetheless. So, Addie, any last thoughts?
No, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us. Thank you so much for Cami for working with me to plan this. This was fantastic.
Yeah. Addie,
I really enjoyed it, and I just want to say, like, I'm excited to see what students do in the future in their careers. If you start doing more with sustainable fashion on campus, just keep me posted, and good luck on your conscious fashion journey.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great night.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.